The new and the old taxonomy, they are based on 6 levels of learning. All levels build on each other. Okay? So you cannot do the higher levels without the lower levels. And it all starts at the very basis of the pyramid with the ability to remember certain facts, to have a certain knowledge. Now, once you have some certain knowledge base, now you can work on understanding, putting those facts together. And once you get into the understanding, you can try to transfer that information to new situations. You get into the application level of learning. And once you can apply to new situations, you may also be able to analyze situations to see what are the components of processes. And once you can do that, it's only a small step, then you can add judgment to that and see, well, which of those is actually slightly better than the other ones. The top level, finally, is the synthesis level, where you put things into the big picture, where you make new connections between formerly unconnected bits and pieces of information. All right, so how does that relate to the active learning? It's very important to point out that you can't get to the higher levels without getting the basis, a sound basis. So remembering and understanding can simply be achieved by remembering or recalling what the teacher told you if you're a student. Those are the passive learning skills. Now, once you get to an understanding level where you truly can apply it, you go now to the higher level skills. Now, I don't know how many of you had students come to you after an exam saying, "This was a really tricky exam. I knew everything in my notes. I knew everything in my book. I could not answer those questions." Okay? The reason for that is what your students were doing. They were studying on those lower levels. Just because the book made sense to them, just because your lecture notes made sense to them, they thought they understood. And so one of the challenges is to actually get the students from the level where they think they understand to a level where they actually truly understand. And this is the critical thinking that we are all concerned about. And the critical thinking, to get to those skills, to practice those skills, we need to practice those higher level active learning skills in our class. Now, science, of course, is based on all these levels. You can't just cut off at the first two. And everyday life, of course, those lifelong learning skills that students will get from this are based on all levels as well. So how can we apply those insights? First of all, we can use Bloom's taxonomy as a teaching tool. Before the semester even starts, we can use it to reflect on our teaching goals, think about what is it really that we want to accomplish with this class, and given that, how should I plan my lessons and class activities to get to those higher active learning skills that I want my students to engage in. It can also help you to decide on your delivery style, and we see some examples today of what those possibilities are. You can use it to formulate your learning objectives. Now, you can also use it as a learning tool for your students. You can use it to communicate to your students exactly what you want them to do, at what levels you want them to focus on. And again, this will give them their tool of making their own study questions, so they can make sure they're not practicing the easiest questions you can come up with, which generally will start with what, when, and those are, of course, the very basic remembering questions. I want to briefly give you some examples. At the very basic level, the remembering levels, a simple question, especially if it's a multiple choice question, simply requires students to pick one of the choices that they can recognize, something they've heard before, or they can recognize wrong choices as well. But that's just picking one right answer that they remember. They don't necessarily have to understand much, they just have to be able to remember. Now, understanding is very similar to that, because the only difference is that they're now remembering an explanation. they don't necessarily understand the underlying processes of that explanation. They may have heard it, you may have told them, they may have read in the textbook about it, and they're able to repeat it to you. Now, once you get to a deeper understanding, once they're able to express it in their own words and come up with their own examples, now you're getting into the application type of questions. In this particular case, they have to apply what they've learned about evolution of size and surface to volume ratio to what happens when you have different cells that are of different size. Analysis question. One possibility to test analysis is to break down a process you've talked to your students about in class or that you have worked with into its individual step. Now, this requires the students to think about, okay, what was the process? How did it follow through step by step? And now let me look at those steps and let me put them back into the correct order. So that's a little bit more involved. So those are analysis skills that are required. Evaluation includes analysis skills, except now the big difference is students can't simply look at the different option and say, well, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense. The key to writing an evaluation question is that you give students options in this question that are all more or less valid. Okay? Sometimes you may put in one that's obviously not valid, but most of them will be valid options, but some of them are better than others. In this particular case, some of them will have less side effects than some of those other options. So if students can discriminate between several valid options and choose the better one, that really shows a deep understanding of what's going on. Now you may notice this is not a multiple choice question, and I personally think it's almost impossible to test the creative process, the synthesis level, with a multiple choice. It may be possible in some cases, but generally, simply you giving the students different options, they can just pick and choose. There's not much creation behind it. So that's usually limited to short essay questions that allows them to do that creative process on paper. Now, then you look at those different levels. I personally wouldn't worry too much at exactly what level it is. I think I would put most emphasis on the lower level, the passive learning levels versus the active learning levels, okay? So the main importance is here to make sure that you challenge your students to move into this active area of learning, and how much you push those individual levels are really an individual preference of you as the teachers. Now let me finish up just briefly by talking about how you can implement this in the classroom, and you will hear a lot of great ideas today of what you actually can do to promote that. But the overall message here is that if you want to implement active learning and make sure that it works, you have to implement it on several levels. Okay? The very first, most important thing is you have to show your students what you're talking about. You have to model that kind of thinking in the classroom. Okay? Now, once the students have a chance to see how that looks like, you have to give them an opportunity to practice it and give them direct feedback on it. You have to challenge your students to think and study on all those levels. And if you ask any students, what will your students tell you?
We do.
We do. Or make me. That's what my students say. Okay? Say, oh, if I don't do well in an exam, I will think about what I have to do different. So what is really a key component that we actually we can't just promote that in the classroom. We have to follow up and assess our students on it so they realize we're serious about it. And so all that together will lead to active learning.